The first we're going to look at is the ionic compounds, so the giant ionic lattices. This happens when we have a metal and a non-metal bonding together, like sodium, the metal, and chlorine, which is a non-metal, and that would look something like this. Your metal would form a positive ion, and your non-metal would form a negative ion, and then they would be attracted to each other, if you've heard the phrase opposites attract, because one's positive and one's negative. So this could be sodium chloride, but it could be any ionic compound. We call this structure a giant ionic lattice. These substances have got high melting points. That means you need to get them really, really hot in order to melt them, maybe 1,000 or even 2,000 degrees. So for that reason, they're going to be solids at room temperature. Now, if you look at the diagram, you've got little dotted lines between the positives and negatives. The ions are being held together by a strong electrostatic attraction. This is an extremely important keyword which you need to remember. An electrostatic attraction is when a positive and a negative thing are attracted together. So we've got positive ions and negative ions, and they're attracted to each other because they have opposite charges. That dotted line, that electrostatic attraction, is an ionic bond. That's what an ionic bond is. It's the electrostatic attraction between the positive and the negative ions. And when we want to melt an ionic compound, we need to break that bond. We need to overcome that attraction, as the red line is showing, split the ions up. It takes a lot of energy to overcome these ionic bonds because the electrostatic attraction is strong. So because it's strong, we have to put a lot of energy in to break the bond. And that's what gives them a high melting point. We have to put a lot of energy in and get them really hot. You might get a question that says something like, explain why sodium chloride has a high melting point. And it might be a 4-mark question. First thing you want to do is say what kind of structure it is. So in this case, it's a giant ionic structure or a giant ionic lattice structure. Any ionic compound will be. That means there's a strong electrostatic attraction. So that would be your 2nd mark for getting that key word in there. The attraction is between positive ions and negative ions. So you might possibly get another mark for saying what the attraction is between if it's a 4-mark question. And one of the most important things is that you need to put in a lot of energy to overcome them. So because the ionic bonds, the electrostatic attraction is strong, we have to put in a lot of energy to break them and turn it into a liquid. Here's some practice questions all about ionic bonding and giant ionic structures. So a reminder that that's what the structure looks like. We've got the positive and negative ions, and they're attracted to each other. Explain why magnesium oxide has a high melting point. And calcium fluoride has a melting point of 1,418 degrees, which is very high. Explain why its melting point is so high. Pause the video and have a go at these questions. So magnesium oxide we know is an ionic compound because magnesium is a metal and oxygen is a non-metal. So we say that it has a giant ionic lattice structure. That means there will be a strong electrostatic attraction. That's your 2nd mark. Make sure you remember that phrase. The attraction is between positive ions and negative ions. Or you could say between oppositely charged ions, which means the same thing. There's your 3rd mark. The reason the melting point is high because it takes a lot of energy to overcome this, or to break the ionic bonds, to overcome the electrostatic attraction. You have to put a lot of energy in, and that's why the melting point is high. Calcium fluoride, again, is ionic, so it has a giant ionic lattice structure. Because it's ionic, we know that there will be a strong electrostatic attraction in that compound, just like the dotted lines in the diagram. Again, it's going to be between the positive and the negative ions. So your 3rd mark, the attraction is between positive and negative ions, or between oppositely charged ions. And then finally, it takes a lot of energy to overcome this attraction, or overcome these bonds, and that's why the melting point is high. Always talk about energy when you're talking about melting compounds. The next type of compound we're going to talk about, or the next type of substance, is giant metallic. So that occurs within a metal. So this time it could just be sodium, or just aluminium, or just magnesium. They would look something like this if you zoomed in. we've got the atoms have lost some electrons. The electrons have become delocalized, so they've turned into positive ions, and the delocalized electrons are floating around the substance. It's like a sea of delocalized electrons. Because the electrons are negative and the ions are positive, there will be an attraction between them, and it kind of sticks the whole substance together. So those dotted lines are your metallic bonds. It's just an attraction between the positive ion and the negative delocalized electron. So this could be an example of the structure of sodium. These giant metallic substances have got high melting points. You have to get them really hot before they melt, and that means that, again, they're going to be solids at room temperature, the only exception being mercury. The ions and the delocalized electrons are being held together by, again, same as last time, a strong electrostatic attraction, because it's still an attraction between positives and negatives, but this time it's between the positive ions, and instead of negative ions, it's the negative delocalized electrons that they're attracted to. So the bond isn't between positive and negative ions, it's between positive ions and negative electrons. And it takes a lot of energy to overcome that, because the metallic bond, the electrostatic attraction, is very strong. It takes a lot of energy to overcome that, and that means they have a high melting point. You have to get them really hot in order to break that bond, because that's what we're trying to do when we're melting one of these substances. So explain why sodium has a high melting point. Now you know straight away sodium is a metal, so it must be metallic bonding. So sodium has a giant metallic structure, would probably get you your first mark. Because it's a metallic structure, there is a strong electrostatic attraction, because we've got positives and negatives involved. But this time the attraction is between positive ions and negative electrons, or negative delocalized electrons, if you can remember that. That probably gets you your third mark. And finally, what makes it a high melting point? Well, these bonds are strong, this attraction is strong, so a lot of energy is going to be needed to overcome that attraction and to break the metallic bonds. So those are 4 example marks. If it's a 3-mark question, one of these points might be missing, but if you write this on every single one that asks about melting point, you're not going to go wrong. Here are some practice questions about giant metallic structures and their melting points. Remember that this is what it looks like. Explain why aluminium has a high melting point for 3 marks. So this time it's a 3-mark question. And iron has a melting point of 1538 degrees. Explain why. Pause the video and have a go at these questions. Right, aluminium is a metal, so it has a giant metallic structure. Say that to get your first mark. Identify the type of structure. That means there's going to be a strong electrostatic attraction. Always get that keyword in there whenever there's positives and negatives involved. And it's between positive ions and delocalized electrons. Now, if it's a 3-mark question, you might not get an extra mark for that. It takes a lot of energy to overcome this attraction. So there's 4 marking points there, but they might be missing the positive ions and delocalized electrons bit. Iron has a giant metallic structure too, because it's a metal. And that means there's a strong electrostatic attraction. Again, it's between positive ions and delocalized electrons. Because the electrostatic attraction is strong, it's going to take a lot of energy to overcome it. So we could have a 3-mark question, we could have a 4-mark question. If it's a 3-mark question, you might just miss out one of those marking points, or they might be able to give it you for both of them. The next type of substance is simple covalent molecules. So covalent bonding happens when you've got non-metals bonding together, such as hydrogen and oxygen bonding together, or carbon and oxygen. So if we have hydrogen and oxygen, this is what we get. We've got a covalent bonding going on. We've got atoms sharing electrons, and they're forming a molecule. So that's 3 atoms there bonded together by covalent bonds, by sharing electrons. So that's an example of one type of covalent compound, and that one is water. So atoms are forming molecules by bonding together, and then each of those molecules, so there's one water molecule, there's another water molecule, and another. Each of those molecules will have a weak attraction to all the other molecules. So we've got attraction between 2 water molecules and another attraction between those 2 water molecules. Their attraction between molecules, so it's called an intermolecular force. That literally means a force between molecules. So they're separate molecules. Each H2O is a separate molecule, but they're attracted to each other. And in order to melt these compounds, you need to break those bonds. Or in order to boil those compounds again, you need to break those bonds. So simple covalent compounds have low melting points and again low boiling points. That means you don't have to get them very hot to be able to melt and boil them. That means they're usually liquids or gases at room temperature. So we've got weak forces holding them together. The molecules are only held together by these weak intermolecular forces. That's the key word for this type of bonding. And you need to remember that. It literally means weak forces holding molecules together. Because those intermolecular forces are only weak, it doesn't take a lot of energy to overcome them. You could overcome them and break them quite easily with only a little bit of energy. And that's what makes the boiling point low and the melting point low. Make sure you talk about intermolecular forces and not intermolecular bonds, because you will not get the mark if you talk about intermolecular bonds. So if we were asked, explain why water has a low melting point for 3 marks. Water has a simple covalent structure. We're identifying the type of bonding. It's a simple covalent molecule. That means that holding the molecules together are only weak intermolecular forces. And that means because they're weak intermolecular forces, you don't have to put a lot of energy in. So your final mark would be very little energy is needed to overcome those intermolecular forces. So it's the opposite of the ones with high melting points. When the melting point is low, you only need to put a little bit of energy in to melt them. This also explains why the boiling point is quite low. Here are some practice questions for simple covalent molecules, for covalent compounds. Explain why oxygen has a low melting point, because there's a covalent bond between the 2 oxygen atoms. And explain why carbon dioxide, a covalent compound, is a gas at room temperature. Pause the video and give these questions a try. So oxygen has a simple covalent structure. We know it's covalent because it only contains non-metals, oxygen. That means there's only weak intermolecular forces holding the oxygen molecules together, holding different molecules together. Because the intermolecular forces are weak, it takes very little energy to overcome them and break them, which is what you need to be able to do when you're melting and boiling these compounds. Again, carbon dioxide is a gas at room temperature because it has a low melting and boiling point, so that might be an extra mark that you could get. That's because it has a simple molecular structure, and just another way of saying it has a simple covalent structure. That means there are only weak intermolecular forces holding the different molecules together. And because those intermolecular forces are weak, we don't have to put a lot of energy in to overcome the intermolecular forces. So it's kind of the opposite of the ones with high melting points. And the last type we're going to look at are giant covalent structures. Again, this occurs when we've got non-metals bonding together or just one non-metal on its own. This is just a few. There aren't many of these giant covalent structures. Most covalent substances are simple covalent, as we've just looked at, but there are a few examples which you need to learn that are giant covalent. This is, for example, diamond, we can see on this diagram. Also graphite, graphene, and silicon dioxide. You just need to memorise those examples. So diamond's a type of carbon, so it's graphite, graphene, and then you've got silicon dioxide is the other one you need to know. Now these substances are a bit different. These have high melting points. So unlike the simple covalent, most covalent compounds or elements, which have low melting points, these guys have high melting points, and that means they're going to be solid at room temperature. The reason they have higher melting points is because we've got covalent bonds holding together individual atoms, and the red line shows you where you would need to break those in order to melt it. Because the atoms are held together by strong covalent bonds, that's bonds actually between atoms, not just weak intermolecular forces, it takes a lot of energy to break those covalent bonds because they're very strong. So the atoms are held together by strong covalent bonds, and it takes a lot of energy to break or overcome those bonds and melt the substance. That's why they have a high melting point. You might be asked, explain why diamond has a high melting point. This is a really popular exam question. So the first thing we need to do is say the structure. And diamond has a giant covalent structure. It's not simple covalent. It's one of the few examples we need to memorise that are giant covalent. That means carbon atoms are held together by strong covalent bonds, or you could just say the atoms are held together by strong covalent bonds. Each of those lines on the diagram is a covalent bond. And that means a lot of energy is going to be needed because they're strong bonds. We're going to have to put a lot of energy in to break those covalent bonds. So they're quite different to simple covalent. Luckily, there's only three or four that you need to remember. So if it's diamond, graphite, graphene or silicon dioxide, this is the type of compound you're looking for. Practice questions for giant covalent structures. Again, they look like this. You've got your atoms held together by each line, which is a strong covalent bond. Explain why graphite, which is one of the ones I mentioned, has a high melting point. And a high temperature is needed to melt silicon dioxide. And the formula for that is SiO2. That's another one you need to remember. Explain why. Pause and have a go. First thing to do is say the type of bonding. Graphite has a giant covalent structure. We know it's one of the few giant covalent compounds, or rather elements, because it's made of carbon. That means it has strong covalent bonds between the different atoms, shown by the lines on the diagram. Because they're very strong, it takes a lot of energy to break them apart. If it takes a lot of energy, that means it's going to need to get very hot before it melts and therefore has a high melting point. Very similar, silicon dioxide has a giant covalent structure, or it's a giant covalent compound. That means between the different silicon and oxygen atoms, there are strong covalent bonds. Because those covalent bonds are very strong, we will have to put in lots of energy to break the covalent bonds. Okay, some practice questions here, but these are mixed, so you've got one from each type. You've got ionic, covalent, metallic, and both of the types of covalent. Explain why hydrogen chloride gas has a low boiling point. I'm going to give you the hint here. It's simple covalent, but you do need to be able to work that out, so make sure you check the other types of bonding video if you wouldn't have known that. Explain why copper has a high melting point. Copper is metallic. Explain why graphene is a solid at room temperature. That's a giant covalent substance. And finally, explain why aluminium oxide melts at 2072 degrees. And I'm just going to give you the hint this time. Giant ionic compound there. Pause the video and have a go at these questions. If we can remember our marking points for simple covalent, first we need to say that it is a simple covalent structure. First mark for saying what kind of bonding it is. That means there's only going to be those weak intermolecular forces between the molecules. That gets us our second mark. And if they're only weak intermolecular forces, it takes very little energy to overcome them. So those would be our 3 marking points. Copper is a metal, so you need to know that it's metallic bonding. So copper has a giant metallic structure, and that gives us our first mark. Because it's metallic, there will be a strong electrostatic attraction, and the attraction is going to be between, this time, positive ions and delocalized electrons, because the electrons are negative. Because it's a strong attraction, it takes a lot of energy to overcome that attraction or to break those metallic bonds. Graphene's a solid at room temperature because it has a high melting and boiling point. That gets us a mark for stating that. And that's because it's a giant covalent structure, because graphene's one of the ones you need to remember. That means the atoms in graphene are held together by a strong covalent bond, or lots of strong covalent bonds between them. Because the covalent bonds are strong, it takes a lot of energy to overcome them or to break them, and that means the melting point will be high. And finally, for aluminium oxide, which is ionic, it has a giant ionic structure, or a giant lattice, ionic lattice structure. That means there will be a strong electrostatic attraction, because it's all about positives and negatives. But this time it's going to be between positive ions and negative ions, or oppositely charged ions, unlike metallic bonding. Because the ionic bonds are strong, it takes a lot of energy to overcome them, and that gives us our high melting point. So there's 4 marking points there. It just depends which ones will be on the mark scheme. You need to be able to figure out which type of compound it is and make sure you know how to do that.